Village of Lake Bluff Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals special meeting on March 7th, 2024. If we could have a call to order and roll call, please.
Yes, I'd like to call the order of the Village of Lake Bluff's Joint Plan Commission and Zoning Board of Appeals special meeting for Wednesday, March 7th, and we'll start with roll call. Member Danley?
Here.
Member Fisher? Here. Member Miller is absent. Member Russell?
Here.
Member Sorensen is absent, and then Member Toll?
Here.
And Chair Peters?
Here.
All right, have
Thank
a
you.
quorum.
Agenda item number 2 is to address any non-agenda items and visitor public comment time. I suspect everybody's here tonight just to learn a little bit about the topic of discussion this evening. So if there's any other topic that anyone wants to address, please stand up, and if not, we'll get on to agenda item number 3. Hearing none, seeing none. Agenda item number 3, please, Clara.
Yeah, so tonight we'll hear a presentation by Jennifer Settle of Opticos on the missing middle housing draft report, specifically though the opportunity sites. And this is a first draft of the report, and that means that it leaves lots of room for discussion and feedback from the PCZBA and from the public. And the goal of tonight's meeting is to consider these opportunity sites and think about the big picture of where and how missing middle housing might make sense in Lake Bluff.
Okay, thanks, Clara. Good evening. Thank you for having me. It's good to be back. I think this is the 3rd or 4th time I've been here, and I do want to. So the topic of tonight is missing middle housing, particularly, as Claire said, a few opportunity sites. Here, let me make sure I'm running the right route here. The missing middle housing study is an effort to inform the comprehensive plan update, which Tesca Associates is currently working on, as well as to start to discuss the idea of zoning changes that could enable new housing choices. We are using key opportunity sites in Lake Bluff to test these ideas. So I do want to clear a little bit of a miscommunication up. We have been working on a draft report that analyzes your zoning, as well as looks at opportunity sites. And so I was not aware that that draft report was going to the public. We still have a lot of vetting to do on that. And the focus of tonight's presentation will really be on those opportunity sites, which we use as tests to look at some of these zoning, existing zoning and the recommendations that we're moving forward. So we can have a lot of zoning discussion tonight. But I just wanted to clear that up, that the focus will be on those opportunity sites, and then the plan is for us to go back to that report and revise and continue discussion with staff. So just wanted to make sure that everyone knew that was the focus for us tonight, but happy to chat more. I think the presentation will be fairly quick. You'll see a brief agenda of what we plan to cover here. The initial slides I'll go through really quickly. This is a recap of the missing middle housing presentation we did last year. It's been a while. We've had a workshop since then. So just a quick catch up on get us all on the same page about what is missing middle housing, right, and why it might be needed, and then what's its implication on zoning. So we'll go through that really quickly. I think that presentation is probably still available, Clara? Yeah, if anyone wants a deeper dive on what is missing middle. And then really the focus is on the 3 opportunity sites that the village gave us to test and visualize what existing zoning is producing, and then what are some of those missing middle scenarios that could work on those sites. And then we'll do a brief overview or what are our next steps, and then have lots of time for questions and discussions. Whoop. You might have to. It was working. All right, so let's go back to the beginning of what is missing middle. We define it as house scale buildings with multiple units in walkable neighborhoods. Everything between that detached single family house and a 3, 4, 5-story apartment building, all these things that have been missing in our neighborhoods that were built historically, and we no longer build them today. Next slide. The premise is about providing housing choices, right, that offer people, go back one, sorry. Offer types like the duplex, the cottage court, or a fourplex, or a townhouse, right? This variety of housing that provides people the needed choices to meet varying needs, right, of people at different stages of life, different income levels, and different interests in community. It's also a key factor in what makes communities walkable and vibrant and supportive of local businesses. Next slide, thanks. The impetus for this study is really going back to your strategic plan goal of encouraging diverse housing for residents in all stages of life. So how do we get this variety of housing options, including condos and townhouses, that fit within the character and scale of Lake Bluff? Next slide. We talked a lot about this last time, so I won't go into too much detail, right? But it's there's a shift in demographics, and people have different housing needs, right? There's a shift to much increasing 1 and 2 person households that no longer need or maybe want that large house with a yard or can't maintain it, as well as aging baby boomers who may want to downsize. There's this whole variety and different housing needs. We want to align our housing choices with these different groups. Next. There's this growing demand for missing middle types in walkable neighborhoods. So 27% of baby boomers are looking for that missing middle type in a walkable neighborhood. The second largest group is millennials, right? Maybe looking, delaying home ownership or looking for that smaller starter home. 60% are looking for that missing middle type in a walkable neighborhood. Next. And what the report really gets at is you have this strategic plan goal to diversify, provide diversity of housing choice, but there's very little area in your community that actually allows anything other than a single family house. So we're not talking about all of Lake Bluff being rezoned for multifamily, but when we look at the picture, we see the only place anything other than a single family house is allowed is in your CBD district zoning, which accounts for just 0.2% of your land area. So this is your land use in your zoning code. And what we see very quickly, right, is that no uses, no multifamily, no condo, no townhouse is allowed except the only use that's allowed by right in all of your zoning districts is the single family dwelling. Even ADUs, which were recently updated, are only allowed by special use, and they are only allowed to be used by a family member, right? So it's very, very limited to your CBD district, where's the only place that multifamily or condos are allowed by right. Next slide. So even your R5 zone, which was intended, when you look at the land use map, you see R5 listed as your multifamily district. Even in that zone, no multi-unit types are actually permitted by right. There's also several other regulatory barriers baked in there that would prevent any type of housing choice like a duplex, like a triplex, or even like a stacked townhouse situation. So you also have minimum lot area, right, that is preventing or not allowing those to be built, your parking regulations, as well as your minimum unit size of 1,050, which is fairly large when we talk about smaller, more affordable, or more attainable units that someone wants to downsize to. So those are all limitations that are further preventing you from meeting that strategic plan goal of providing this diversity of housing. So what we want to get at tonight is how do we start to enable some of these diverse housing options that meet the needs of a whole variety of people at different ages, at different life stages, right? We see a lot of opportunity for young professionals, young adults who would want a 3 or 4-plex, single person households, downsizing boomers, or small families who want that townhouse or a cottage court that allows you to have your own small standalone house and more of a community, but really reduce that maintenance and things like that. Next. So when we talk about missing middle, I went into a lot of the characteristics last time, last presentation, but the two things we really want to focus on is that first and foremost, it's middle in scale. We're talking about the form, the scale, and the type. So we're talking everything from that width, the depth, and the height is all under that 2.5 stories, right? Really in the same size as your typical single-family house. It's a really key piece of making this work. So when we talk about it, it's not just about getting more units on a lot. That form is super important to missing middle. It's the house scale. And the primary objective is to deliver good design outcomes that fit in your typical neighborhood. So this is a 3-unit building made to look like a house. We think they did it fairly well. The second piece of missing middle is that it can be attainable to middle income housings. We're not talking about capital A affordable. We're really talking about that 80 to 120 AMI, right? That middle income household. So that's the second piece. Because they're smaller units, they're still built with the same stick frame construction. You can offer them at a slightly lower point. You can go to the next slide, sorry. You can offer those, right, at a slightly lower price point than your standalone detached house. So part of the premise is that you spread out those land costs over multiple units. And you're often using smaller units to make them less expensive. At Opticos, we really started using these 3 metrics to understand when missing middle is actually successful. So we want it to be feasible to be built, so that developers can actually deliver these product types. It has to be attainable, meaning it can be, it matches the price point and types that are needed in your community. And then of course, it needs to be contributing to a livable place to live, both inside and within the neighborhood. The goal of missing middle is that it can add more attainable options to your housing stock, right? So that may mean increasing rental options. It may mean smaller, more attainable options for downsizing families or starter homes. All these things that increase housing diversity. It can also mean allowing homeowners to add units on existing lots to offset some of those housing costs and mortgage costs that we know are growing. We start to see different types within Lake Bluff, and these are ones we want to acknowledge, both some of their successes and their shortcomings, that you do have a little bit of variety, especially around your CBD and downtown, as well as in some of the outer skirts where you have some of these side-by-side duplexes. And of course, the history of Lake Bluff, I think there's the map on the wall somewhere, maybe it's back there. Oh, downstairs, sorry. Of this cottage, those heritage lots that were built on these small lots, smaller homes that offer these really great opportunities for a starter home or a smaller property really close to your downtown, close to the metro. Do you remember when we did this workshop? I can't remember, January now? Was it January? Something like that. As part of the comprehensive plan, part of the process is hearing from the community. When you start to look at your strategic plan goal that we saw earlier, what does that actually translate to? So TESCA ran a workshop where we contributed some housing type and got a lot of feedback on what are the potential housing types that you want to see, right? We talked about this in the first presentation, but not all missing middle types are appropriate in the village of Lake Bluff, right? So we want to understand which ones fit on your existing lot sizes, which ones are needed in your community. So that left-hand board on poster on the left really starts to highlight the desire for cottage courts, townhouses, and a preference for the side-by-side duplex over things like the stacked duplex. So that starts to give us some information that can inform where to go next. And now we get to the main part of tonight and where we're at in our study. So we've You can go to the next slide. We're visualizing missing middle scenarios on existing lots. This gives us a lot of information about what types fit in your community, how do they fit within the context, and then of course, how do they align or not align with the underlying zoning for those properties. So we looked at 3 sites per the suggestion of staff as well as the PCZBA. 2 of which are ones you see here in your CBD. So block 1 as well as block 3, and then the next one. And then we also looked at a larger site just south of Rockland Road, west of the Terrace neighborhood, and east of the water facility. So these gave us the opportunity to look at what types fit, what's the zoning like, and visualize what are some of the opportunities for sort of less intense and more intense missing middle options on these sites. When we go back to the characteristics of missing middle, one of the things we talk about is this opportunity to provide housing near amenities, right? So these sites came up, of course, block 1 and block 3, because they're embedded right in the heart of your downtown. I will say, is it First Thursday is a thing? Or is it just that because your parking's full, right? It's active, it's amazing. It's pretty incredible what you have here in a relatively small footprint. So I will eat my words if anyone says, if I ever say you don't have enough parking or you have too much parking. It was all full and active. So block 1 and block 3 obviously give you that walkability, that proximity to Metro, to your downtown, to all the great things that Lake Bluff has to offer. But we were also pointed to this larger site, which was really appealing for a lot of reasons. One, it's still very close. I mean, nothing's too far in Lake Bluff. But certainly very accessible to the Metro and to downtown, as well as to the grocery store, Heinen's, this Target, right in and along the trails. So a really interesting site to test out what this might look like on both smaller, more constrained lots, as well as larger properties within the village. So those are the 3 types that we looked at. The goal here is twofold, right? It's to create visualizations and conversations about what missing middle could look like, as well as to understand what is the zoning doing or not doing? How would it need to change? How could it stay the same? And have some of those conversations. Thanks. When we look at these 3 sites, one of the things that we look at is that future land use. This was from your last comprehensive plan, which of course is being updated. This study is giving recommendations to that comp plan and supporting decisions about the future of these parcels. So it's really important to have these conversations, and we hope the visualizations will start to help inform the conversations that will go into that comp plan. So this is our starting point, right? The future land use map calls for block 1 to be mixed use, block 3 to be multifamily, and then the large site was identified as institutional. So an interesting starting point. We'll talk more about that one a little bit later, but we'll dive into block 1 and block 2, where we're really looking at how do you achieve that mixed use and multifamily, and what does that look like? Again, this is a snapshot just to get us on the same page of what we're trying to do with these visualizations. The first step that we went through when we start these is to look at what is the buildable envelope that your existing code is giving us. That's that sort of big box. Just set the basic parameters of what is the space that you're actually allowed to build in. The second step is then looking at what it's encouraging, what outcomes. Once you put landscaping, parking, roof forms, stories, all of those things on the lot, what are you actually encouraging to be built? And then the third step, of course, is to take some of those missing middle types and put them on the lot, see what fits, test out a few scenarios, and then look at what are the things in the zoning that would actually have to change if you were to allow that, and start to have that conversation about how we might push and pull things. So let's start with block 1. The existing uses, this is zone CBD, so it's pretty permissive. It's about as permissive as you get within your zoning, but it is the most constrained site, right, of the three that we looked at. So this one does allow residential uses, including townhouses, apartments, and condos. It does have what we call a density regulation that allows approximately 11 units on this size site. This is all your current code. The setbacks are based on the street frontage, right? So you get 20-foot and 15-foot setbacks. You have your highest height allowance on block 1 at 35 feet, which fits 3 stories. And you have 60% max building coverage, right? So the amount of building footprint on the lot can only go up to 60%. And then your parking is also one of the lower within your code at 1.5 spaces per dwelling unit. So this is our starting point. And when we try to put development on that site, we're keeping the existing building there, which has 8 units. So what we're left with is this box that allows 3 units, generates units that are about 1,600 square feet. And there's no physical way on this site, it's very constrained, to meet your parking requirements. So usually we try on this first one to meet all the zoning standards that we can. On this one, we couldn't put any development if we were to meet those 1.5. This is a really constrained site. That's just where we're at. So the limiting factors on this are those setbacks, that parking, and the density. You'll see the setbacks don't even allow you to build a building that match the one that's right next to it. So this just gives us sort of a starting point to understand what your current code is producing. Next slide. And then we start to look at what if you start to put a mixed use or a missing middle building on that site. We started with sort of a modest 6-plex, 2 stories, which would give you an additional 6 units on top of the 8, which would allow 14 units on that site. Again, you can only provide 6 spaces in the area that's left there, but there's ample opportunity, if it were allowed, to provide. You would have to provide the rest of the parking on street and figure out a way to navigate those parking standards. Next. So that was our low threshold. Again, this keeps the 8 units over commercial in the existing building, 6 units. This is where we start to get that downsizing of units, and these end up being about 880 square feet. But what's required to get this outcome? If you said, oh, this is an outcome we can get behind, we can see this working, we want this, you would have to reduce your setbacks from that 20 feet to about 7 feet. You'd have to reduce your parking standards in this scenario to 0.5 spaces per dwelling units, and you'd have to allow a little bit increase in density to get this. So we just want to start to understand what are the metrics that would have to change if you said this is an appropriate use on that site. Next slide. And then we push it a little bit further. We said, okay, we got direction that this is the only place in the core that might be able to support 3 stories. It's right by the Metro. It's right by parking, right by downtown. If we pushed, how many could we get in a 3-story building? And we end up getting 9 units in a small multiplex, right? That's on top of the 8 units. So we start to look at, next slide. You can see there's a little bit of parking still tucked behind. The setbacks, again, get reduced, this time just to 8 feet, but the parking really has to go way down. And that's a conversation that needs to happen to understand this is not something we would recommend, a 0.25 for most sites, but it's that conversation to be had to say, if we want this site to develop, if we say in our land use plan that this needs to be multifamily or mixed use, that's a choice we have. It can either stay and remain parking, or it can be built without parking. There's really not a great, on this constrained site, we'll see other options on the other sites, but on this one, it really comes down to what height and what parking is desired, and then are you willing to reduce your setbacks and your density to actually allow something to get built on that site because it's so constrained. So you can kind of start to see, we try to look at both a lower opportunity and a higher opportunity on the site and have that conversation about what's feasible, what types are becoming attainable. Block 3 is an interesting site because it's got two different zoning on the same block. And this is where we have CBD, and then there's two parcels that are zoned R4. When we started this conversation, R4, it was not a zone we were looking at. We didn't intend to look at it, we didn't intend to make recommendations, but because some of your downtown blocks, Block 3 in particular, is zoned R4, we dove into it to see what was happening. And that's one of the things I'll put out there. We've gotten very clear directive that R4 is not one of the zones that we want to change or make adjustments to, and so we understand that. And we're looking at, so anyone who read the draft that came out, the R4 recommendations are being removed. I think we had a note in there that was up for conversation, but the reason it got studied was because it was on this block. So just so that we clear that all up. But we want to look at the interesting thing about this block. For a very small community and a very small landmass, you have a really complicated zoning code. It's sort of kind of interesting because we look at a lot of zoning codes, and many of them are very convoluted and complex. Yours is very interesting because there's not a lot of land area for R5 and CBD, but there's a lot of standards. And so we try to get really simple tables, but I'll admit in that document they're really in the weeds because there's so many different. So if we look at a block like this that just has 3 parcels, it has 3 different front setbacks. It has 2 different densities. It has 2 different height standards, right? It has 2 different lot coverages, 2 different parking standards. That's really hard for a developer to navigate, right? It's really hard to understand what the community wants to see on this lot because you jump from, right, all these different parameters, a 60% lot coverage to a 30 in the same block. So what we encourage is to say, take a look at this and say, where do you want to land? And write your zoning accordingly to what outcomes you actually want to see on that block, and make it reasonable. So this was a really fun site, a really interesting site. We know there's been a lot of exploration of the site in the past, so we're trying to tread lightly. We know that these are visualizations to see where do you want to land? Where should your regulations be to align with the vision for Block 3? So that's what we're trying to get at. Next slide. So this is our starting point. If we were to put buildings on these lots that aligned with the existing underlying zoning, this is a typical outcome that you would see. Probably a lot of questions on this, but what's happening here, parcel A is fairly straightforward. It's producing a mixed-use building. You could get 6 units. You could get your parking in the rear. Check that box. When we look at the R4 parcels, the first thing that we notice is that neither one of those meets the minimum lot size for development in R4. So you're immediately asking someone by the book to consolidate those lots to build on it. So once we do that, we have a lot that meets that 7,500 lot minimum, but you're only allowed to do 1 unit in R4 on those lots. So this is a very unlikely scenario. We're just painting the picture of what your zoning is saying is wanted on these lots. That's the point of zoning, right? To say, what do we want to see? What do we think is appropriate? So we paint this picture, say that's what it's telling us. That's likely what it's telling developers. A lot of people in this room know that there's probably somewhere in the middle for this lot that the PCZBA, that the village would support, but it's very unclear when you read your zoning of what that outcome is, right? So that's what we're getting here. Next slide. If we were to say, okay, your land use, your future land use plan says we want more multifamily on this site. We know the corner parcel is CBD and wants mixed use. What outcomes might that establish? We heard a lot of conversation about keeping it to 2-story, separating the buildings, breaking down the massing of the buildings. So that's what we're trying to capture here. We recognize that as you move across the site towards Evanston Avenue, that is, it makes sense to move towards that house scale. And so we're trying to sort of mirror what's happening on the north side of the block, and transition in that mass of the building. And so what you end up getting in this visualization is a mixed-use building with 6 units on that corner building A, with commercial space underneath it that could support and add more activity to your downtown, but then transitions to all residential in both a courtyard building that would break down the scale along the street. And then on the end, that corner is a side-by-side duplex, one of the types that we saw in the workshop that resonated as people preferred that type. So that's what we're showing there. And then on the back lot, we're showing an ADU that could help transition around that corner. This scheme was really targeting to provide at least 1 space per unit. So in all of those buildings you see there, you're getting about 15 total units, and you're providing 17 off-street spaces. We think that's kind of the minimum viable, right? We wouldn't want to go lower than that for off-street covered parking or on the actual same lot. So we have to remember, we also know that if you were to look at street parking or find some way to figure out neighborhood parking, which I know is a hot topic, not something we're making recommendations on, you'd have to figure out a way to provide that second parking space if it was desired. But on these parcels, you can easily provide 1 space per unit, which when we talk about smaller 1-person households, I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation. It gets a little bit scary, but there's lots of visitor parking, street parking within, and when we're talking about these smaller units, in most cases, they don't necessarily need or want that second car. And so this is where in a CBD, we're providing that, are accounting for this type of density with 1 space per unit. If you go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. This is just saying, on this one, what were the adjustments that had to be made to the zoning to allow this? So first and foremost, you had to remove that minimum lot area to allow this to happen. You had to reduce those setbacks, especially on the eastern 2 parcels. Again, talked about the parking, as well as the density. So in this case, this actually works under the CBD's allowed density, but it's that R4 that was sort of pushing down the number there. So that's just trying to give you a sense of where something like that is landing so that you can choose your regulations based on that. The next one is really, what if we pushed for as many units as we could get on this site, still keeping below that 2 and under story. So in this scheme, we get 22 units. And that's made up of a mix of live-work units that still might allow some of that flexibility of commercial space on the ground floor, but providing a unit above. It's working with, if you look at this number C, that larger multiplex that has 7 units, but still is broken down with that residential house scale character that transitions into the neighborhood. There's some townhouses tucked in there as well. And so we just want to understand, if we push this, we could get 22 units. The off-street parking does go down to 12 spaces. So we want to talk about, that push and pull. Where's the right mix? Certainly you could get more if you eliminated that D building there and get more parking, but it's a trade-off, right? What does the community want to see, right? Where do people want to live with fronting onto an open space into the middle of the block or a parking lot back there? Bless you. So very similar adjustments required, where you're requiring to remove that minimum lot area to reduce the setbacks. Again, the parking gets pushed down, and we need to have that conversation about where it's appropriate. And then, of course, the density on this one is landing about 30 dwelling units per acre, which is still well under what's allowed in your CBD today. But it's really providing that mix of unit types and looking at how they can still fit in buildings that are relatively broken down, and they aren't a full block scale building, right? Where it's all 2-story connected, taking up the entire block. Next. So now we're gonna make a really big jump to 11-acre site just south of Rockland Road. And the interesting thing, I think, Georgia, you may have been the one to point us to this site, or the conversation, not to put you on the, and we were gonna study another large site, and the village said, why not this one? And when we looked at it, we thought, holy moly, like this is a really great opportunity site to study. We talked about the location, there's existing rights of way through there, it's village owned. And so we wanted to look at, it certainly has some constraints, some limitations, but we wanted to look at, you have a couple of these larger sites in and around the village of Lake Bluff. So what are we talking about what does it look like if we were to put missing middle? But again, next slide. Is everybody familiar with this site? Just for, figured everyone in the room. So this is just south of Rockland Road. There's the water treatment plant to the left. There's the terrace neighborhood to the right. If you go a half mile west, there's the Target. If you go a half mile east, you sort of get dropped into downtown. So this scheme, again, we start with what's the status quo? What are your current regulations encouraging? And so we looked at what if sort of the lot structure and the roads of that neighborhood just kind of kept carrying through. There's the existing right-of-way, it's always laid. What if that got built out with lots that met the criteria? The assumption is this is institutional, so you would have to use your PRD tool to develop this. And we start to look at what's driving the outcomes here. It's that lot size, it's a setback around the whole site of 30 feet. It's sort of unclear on your parking parameters for that one. And then it relies on those uses allowed in the base zoning. So we were matching the existing residential to just look at how many units you would get if it started continuing that pattern. This gives us that baseline for comparison. So you get 24 dwelling units, 15% open space, and then you get parked 2 cars per unit with those attached garages. So that's our starting point. What if we took some of those housing types, those footprints that we know well for the cottages, for those side-by-side duplexes, and started to put them on the site? What does that enable you to get? So it certainly bumps up the number of units that you could have on that site to anywhere, depending on which types. A lot of these are interchangeable because all that changes, right, is the actual size of the unit. So you could have 4 650 units, or you could have 2 or 3 800 or 1,000, right? So that's why you see a range of units in there. We just want to sort of get a sense of where that's going. The density is still fairly low, 6 to 8 dwelling units per acre. You're still getting that same amount of open space, and you're getting a mix of your parking is at 1 space on the lot as well as 1 space per unit on the street. But you're getting that mix of smaller cottages, plenty of single unit houses in this development as well, duplexes, triplexes, multiplexes, and then some ADUs. What it's gaining you is these community open spaces, this opportunity to live in connection with the trails and the existing neighborhoods. Next slide. So these are what some of those housing types could look like. There are 2 multiplexes in there that would take the shape of those grander old houses. There are several duplexes like you see in that lower corner. And then there's several of these cottage courts and then ADUs. So we want to look at what that would look like from a physical standpoint and how we could create streets that are residential in character, still in scale and in line with the character and an opportunity to live in Lake Bluff, but provide some of these housing choices that aren't currently in your market or in your village. Next slide. So we want to look at what that feels like on the ground. I think when most people think about multifamily housing, right, we think of much bigger apartment complexes, right? We can offer it in forms. So this is a view that we mocked up of that main green space that connects by trail into the terrace neighborhood. And it looks like, it's meant to look like larger houses of a similar scale that you see all over Lake Bluff, but that might have 2 or 3 or 4 units inside of them. but they front onto these great green spaces that then lead you into the wonderful network of trails and parks that you have in Lake Bluff. Next. And then there's a view into these cottage courts, a really in-demand product that offers that smaller unit with a shared space that they front onto. Really great opportunity for community, for single person or two-person households to still live in that active community, but maybe not have the same amount of maintenance or house to take care of. So what we try to capture, there are many, many different ways that these sites could be designed and developed. What we're trying to do is capture what it would look like. What's the form that you want Missing Middle to look like, and how would it fit? And start to have that conversation about where is too much, where's too little, where are there opportunities to deliver more housing, and which types make sense where in Lake Bluff to deliver these house-scale buildings that start to offer multiple units with access to these really great amenities in the village. Thanks. Part of this conversation and part of these exercises start to get feedback, to understand what's actually feasible to get built. What would a developer say, yes, I can make that work? In many cases, right, a developer will say, well, I can only get 2 units on that lot. It's not worth my money, or I have to sell them for $1 million, right? And neither of those are really meeting the goals of your strategic plan. So we want to get feedback. We want to use these visualizations to start to have the conversation within your community of what types you want to see, but then also have the conversation with developers and builders to say, what would you build? What could you build? What would make sense from your pro forma? So we've started, this is just the initial conversations. We'll have some more of these. We hope that part of this process, part of giving you the opportunity sites, is that the PCZBA can start having conversations with community members, with builders, developers to say, where would you push back on this? What do you think? Would this work? Why won't you build that? So we've started some of those conversations to understand what's the development landscape for some of these sites. These are just a lot of high-level feedback, but it was really great opportunity to start to have these conversations. So what we heard from developers so far, the need for more tuck-under types. That's where the parking is underneath that first floor in a townhouse form typically, as an opportunity to maybe bump up some of those parking numbers that you saw that were really low. Is there opportunity for that? Comments about how efficient that is for a developer. But we talked about this in the first one. The need to allow those townhouses to be smaller was one of the comments that we got. Because townhouses can be a big footprint. They tend to be expensive products. And so there was a lot of conversation about that. The other one that was brought up was that one that we hadn't talked about. When we talk about Missing Middle, there are products that align better with a rental product. There are products that align better with homeownership, right? Cottage courts really make sense, and townhouses make sense for a homeownership opportunity. Some of the others lend themselves more to rent. One of the feedback we got from the developers is to be thinking about rent by choice products. So townhouses that could be offered as rental. They're seeing a shift. This was actually one that we didn't have in our recommendations off the bat, but there's a shift in single-person households, divorcees, boomers that actually are choosing to rent, but they still want that single-family type. And so starting to think about that was one of the feedback that we got. The big one that we hear a lot that came up in our conversation as well, builders and developers are hesitant to use these new types. There's a perceived inefficiencies in them in terms of fire rating, appraisal, right? There's not a lot to compare them to. And so there's a little bit of a risk there for a developer. First, if they don't have these products in their typical portfolio, they're gonna be resistant to be the first one to do them in a community. And they wanna be able to deliver them at scale, right? So some of the feedback we got is that larger site is much more appealing, where they could do 15 or 30 of these units as opposed to just 3 or 4 one-offs. The next point we got, especially related to that larger site, was this push and pull of, hey, I don't want to do high density on this whole 10-acre site, right? But if I'm able to do a little bit more of those multi-unit buildings on 1 or 2 acres of the site and get my numbers up, it actually helps the baseline for what I can deliver that whole site. So if I'm doing smaller single family on the rest of the site, I can actually deliver that at a lower price point because I've made some gains on just that 1 or 2 acre portion of the site. So what this starts to tell you is get creative and understand what that push and pull is for developers so that your zoning and your community can support that. Related to that was this idea that I don't say this in many communities because a PD tool, planned unit development, PUD, or planned residential development in this case, can get tricky to navigate and to implement. But this was one that we felt pretty strongly makes sense in Lake Bluff for a lot of your community if you can make very small changes, and if you can start to say, what do we actually want to see on the site? But one of the feedback they said was, please remove that 6-acre minimum. This was not us, although that was part of our recommendations, but we did get feedback on that to say we want to have that flexibility on some of these larger sites without some of those constraints, like the 30-foot boundary and the 6-acre minimum. The one on the top list was a big takeaway. Costs are up. Everything that you see on this right, it's very hard to develop in the market today. Most developers have pencils down, right, because of the cost of constructions and things like that. One of the big ticket items that was brought up, particular to Lake Bluff, but also to many other, is the cost of infrastructure. The cost of stormwater and the requirement to provide that on site is very limiting for developers, and it drives up the cost of the housing that they're delivering. So this is great feedback for the village to say, and we hear this a lot, it was just in another community where they said, we can't build, the only thing we want you to change are your sewer and water tap fees, right? It matters. Those regulations and those requirements have an impact on what developers are able to do or not do. So it's something to be aware of as you start thinking about land use and the future of these larger sites, is what role the village wants to play in supporting or understanding those infrastructure costs and what a developer can and can't do in terms of stormwater requirements and things like that on site. That's not to say these things aren't needed, but it may be making or breaking the development potential of these sites. The next one I know is one that has come up many times in Lake Bluff, is this conversation of height and parking. Height and parking, no matter what community we go in, drive the majority of development outcomes. What's allowed into, and we put them in the same category, and the developers put them in the same category because of that first one, that tuck under type. And the first thing they said, I know this is a conversation, it wasn't one we were gonna touch, but if I can't have 35 feet in height, I'm not coming in, I'm not thinking about doing those tuck under types because I can't get the height to do them. Developers see that and they say, all right, nope, I can't develop here. And so it's a conversation to be had. You have a lot of heights that have been really well thought out, right? But they're a mix of 30 feet to 35 feet to 32 feet. And so the more you can be consistent and understand what a developer can and can't do is really important so that you can have those conversations to say, we understand, this is where we feel strongly about 2 stories, this is where we would allow it, and it's written so that it can actually achieve those higher outcomes where you want them. Minimum habitable space and allowing smaller units on a lot. Your lot size and your minimum unit size is maybe appropriate for most of the village, but where you want to see this diversity of housing, it's a huge barrier. It's one that came up in the developer. The number one way you can reduce cost is to make smaller units, right? These need to be livable units. They have to be well-designed units, but that's the number one way to offer a more attainable price point and for a developer to actually get the units he needs to build something. So that was some of the feedback. But that's a push and pull. Once you build that first smaller unit, it's hard to keep it affordable or lower over time. Once a successful project comes in, like those cottage courts, we often see the next one drive up prices because it's so in demand. Right? So that's something to be thinking about. The last one I want to talk about, and I promise I'm wrapping up, here, but the last one that was noted, I asked the question, why hasn't this site been developed? I've heard a lot of conversations from the village. Why haven't, these seem so ripe for something. Why haven't they been? And they are honest and say, well, we know we can't do a viable product with the zoning when we see height, we see parking, and we see things like that. But also we've heard stories. And they've mentioned a few sites, one of which was on the table, and said, we heard what happened, and it was a battle. And we weren't clear. We designed something we thought worked, and we got pushed back. This wasn't on that person, but they had heard stories of other developers who tried and failed and got a lot of pushback on the community. This was Stonebridge site, which I know has a whole lot of baggage along with it. But it's that conversation of how can you say, we want housing here, we want to be open to work with developers, but this is what it's about being predictable. You still have control to say this is what we want. We care about scale, we care about the character, but you need to make that clear and say this is what we want. We will back you, we will support you to do a good project. But if you aren't saying that, if your zoning's saying, we don't know what we want, we're gonna have to figure it out on the fly, you're gonna have to design something over and over, get feedback in multiple public meetings, that's cost that a developer is not gonna carry. That's not a fight, they're not gonna come to the table. So I think this is a really important one to have in your community, to say, where do we want development, and how are we showing people that we're open for that, and we know what we want, and if you do this, if you follow these rules and these expectations, we will make it easy for you. So it's that conversation to be had of just setting that out, and that's part of what I think, why we start with your zoning, because that's the first place you look for that. Next.
Quick question, just real
Yeah.
quick, tuck under, the term tuck under, is the parking half below grade or is not necessarily?
It's on the, typically, it's on the
At grade?
first at grade.
Okay,
So you come in the rear and there's usually ideally a little room up front. If you've seen those townhouses, you come into a vestibule or an office or a room. The parking garage is behind it from a rear loaded. And then most of the living space is on that second 2.5 or 3 story. It's a really, if you allow that to be built, that is what developers will build all day. Every developer you talk to, that's the most efficient type. It has some limitations in terms of accessibility and that height component. You can do it in 2.5 stories, but it's fairly hard to do in 2 because you get mostly parking on the ground floor and then a unit above it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? It can be either, you can load it from the front, but then you get a garage at that whole front level. Yeah, go ahead.
Question about the infrastructure stormwater costs.
Yeah.
Kind of what is the problem there, that it costs too much or that our requirements are too high?
You know, we did not look at your infrastructure requirements in much detail. Typically, what we see is that it's the cost. It's just the cost. So for your PRD standards, you must provide X percentage of stormwater. You must deal with that on site in a consolidated space. And then the other piece of that is, of course, providing roads and alleys, and that's one of the conversation with the large sites, right? If you do alleys, you get a much better streetscape, but it's an additional cost. So to offset that, you need more units. So that's
I'm thinking of stormwater in
Yeah,
particular,
yeah.
especially here.
super important.
I mean, if you don't do that right from the beginning, you have future costs for the homeowners.
Right, flooding and things like that is an incredible, yeah, you have to deal with it. What often is recommended, right,
Particularly for that large site.
for the large site in particular, and we are showing the stormwater.
It's got hydrology issues.
Yes, right, exactly, and so you do have to deal with that. It's not that they're saying they don't want to deal with it, but it's a prohibitive cost, and so that's where we would say, village, you know this has to happen, right? How can you guys form a public-private partnership to offset some of those costs for the developer, right? You still have to deal with it. There's 2 things. One, you can start to say, maybe not every lot has to deal with it, right? Can we deal with it for this neighborhood? So if you think about that large site, maybe a developer wants to come in and just do the cottage court at the front, right? And another home builder wants to do 10 single-family homes in the back. If you're requiring each of those to deal with it separately, it's cost prohibitive, and it's also not great from usually a neighborhood perspective. But how could the village say, we understand this is an issue, we're gonna deal with this as a whole large site, each developer is gonna pay in a bit. Right? So it's just one of those things we wanna acknowledge and figure out that that's a barrier to new development. It's not to say you can't, you have to deal with that, you have to provide access and infrastructure. But you wanna take a look at your street standards. Right? If that neighborhood is serving 50 houses, it doesn't need a 60-foot wide right-of-way, which is more cost than concrete. Maybe it can get by with a smaller right-of-way. Things like that to be aware of the cost implications and how developers perceive that as either, is the village ready to work with you on it? Or are they sort of saying, this is our standard, deal with it? So I think we can go to the next slide. We can come back to any of these. I'm wrapping up. The idea of this, the forthcoming report and these opportunity sites is really to start to build community support and understanding of what type of housing we're talking about, and really dive in deeper of what does it mean to provide that diverse housing option. The second piece is to inform your comprehensive plan update, to talk about where new housing types make sense. When we look at these sites, how could that inform their future land use, things like that. The third piece is to have that conversation about zoning fixes. When we're talking about zoning fixes, we're talking about R5, we're talking about CBD, we're talking about maybe your ADU and your PMD tools. And then the final one is to continue to have these conversations about what would be feasible to build, and where a pilot project might make sense. So when we talk about pilot projects, that large site, maybe you say, we're not ready to change zoning, but let's test it here, see what the outcomes are, see what the results are when you start to build these cottage courts and the demand for it, and you'll understand better then how you could then tackle some of your zoning fixes. So those are sort of the reason we were asked to do these studies, what we hope for it will help facilitate that conversation with the broader community and the PCZBA. So with that, we'll open it up for conversation and discussion. Thank you so much for the time here. We certainly think there's a ton of opportunity, and we hope this furthers that conversation. We can certainly go back to any of the opportunity sites that you want to look at more closely.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Hi, okay, so I have a question in terms of, let's say, with single-family zoning, ADU may be allowed, maybe we get past the single-family connection that has to be both parts of it and everything.
Yeah.
In your experience, how does financing work into this?
Yeah. For ADUs in particular, you asked?
ADUs, or can you have single-family with condo zoning, or with condo financing? You know, does zoning
Yeah.
dictate financing? Because I'm hearing that people want to do some of these, but maybe they are looking at one family doing it, but down the line, half of the family could get transferred or something. If we can get past the one-family
financing.
ownership, how do we handle, not everybody is a cash buyer.
Yeah, it's tricky. It's one of the barriers that we talk about a lot, is that our
Okay.
financial mechanism, our financial tools don't always align with these. We are seeing a shift in that.
Okay.
And it's a good conversation to have with your local financing community, with your local banks. And there are tools. You know what I mean? I think condos typically don't make sense until you get to that sort of 4 or 6 unit, and even then it's hard from a liability, from a property management standpoint. That's one of the barriers that comes up, but you can do it in terms of a condo. The single family is usually both with duplex and with the ADUs.
Mm-hmm.
Those can be financed with a typical 30-year mortgage. The ADUs are harder. to do, and those often take cash or small loans to finance. But that's changing as they're becoming more acceptable and more sort of prevalent in our communities. But typically those would be an ownership by a single entity and then rented out to the unit. And that's one where I don't think you're there yet, but where, you know, you may have to take preemptive steps to say, okay, we need to track these as rental units. But in the vast majority of cases, we see them rented out to a family friend or a family member anyway. And when you start to put on those home ownership requirements, they make them so complicated that they don't get built or they don't get financed.
Right, so that's one of my questions about the ADUs. Are we not seeing that because, you know, financing is a piece of it? But just to clarify, so you're saying that zoning itself does not impact how something can necessarily be financed?
Not at all.
Okay,
No,
good.
not at all. Yeah,
If you have a
I wish
creative-
the two were better aligned. The thresholds are all different,
Right,
right? In terms of what's considered multifamily by the bank versus what's
Right.
considered those two are not always aligned, and they have different criteria for those things. They have different criteria for parking as well. So even if you reduce your parking, that's a conversation that a developer will have with the banks as well. So that's an important thing to be aware of. Your zoning is not saying that this needs to be rental, although you guys do actually have that stipulation that they must be condo, so that's something to think about if you want to encourage rental, right? That's sort of staying right off the bat. We don't, by the choice of terms that you're using in your zoning. Yeah, go ahead.
Is ADU like a guest house?
Sorry, ADU is an accessory dwelling unit. It can be known as a granny flat, a carriage house. It can be a guest house. It's the same property, right? It's on the same property as a single family house. It's a separate, it could be attached or detached, but has a separate entrance. And so it can be used by that same family. In Lake Bluff, you have a stipulation that it must be lived in by the same family based on your zoning's definition of family. But it does provide that sort of second unit that you could use as a home office, as another unit and things like that.
Got a couple questions in your exploration of Block 1 specifically.
Yeah.
So we've got the current building on there. Did you look at if that was a totally undeveloped site, what would be the optimum?
Oh, we were so
usage of that?
tempted. We were really tempted because that would make it a whole lot more feasible. But the reality is, in today's market, it's really hard to tear down a building that's in good shape. You may not like how it looks, and I think what we thought about more in that is how you could sort of reface it and reconfigure that building. So we did play with the idea of keeping it, but from a preservation standpoint, it's really hard to justify tearing down 8 units, especially because you'll never be able to build that many with your current parking requirements. So we shied away from it. There have been explorations that Drew could certainly point you to in the past of the missing middle competition that did sort of wipe the slate clean.
Sure.
But we tried to err on the side of what's possible on that constrained site and what would
Most
have to
likely.
change.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then along the parking lines that, in that new multi-unit building,
Yeah.
would it be possible to do underground parking?
So, you mean like underground? Yeah. The numbers don't work. And we see this in most markets, in sort of suburban markets, that the cost to put structured parking or underground parking is so prohibitive that you would really need to have a 50-unit building to ever make that make sense for a developer. It's a substantial cost to dig and put concrete to put that. I do think this would be a viable site for that tuck under product, but it was really tricky to get the accessibility or the access into those. You have to have sort of a backing out area of 24 feet. And so the size of this, we could only ever get those 3 units that you saw that first round with tuck under parking even. So that was sort of where we,
And we actually saw that at one point with the Block 3, there was somebody who suggested underground parking for Block 3, and that came up there as well,
yeah,
it just
so,
wasn't economically feasible.
yeah, I mean, so I think that would be the block, if you were to do underground parking or any sort of structured parking, that would be the block to do it. But the reality is, that means getting 50 units on that parcel. And I think everything we've heard from the community, right, that means a 4-story building. In almost every market we go to, we're working in Columbus, Ohio on their corridors, urban districts, right? They can't even get a 4-story building with podium to pencil out. They need that 5 or 6-story, which is sort of, which I don't think anybody is suggesting for like Bluff. So it's that trade-off, right? If you were to do podium there, I mean, those units they might be 600 square feet, but they would go for 600,000 just to cover the cost of the parking.
I have a question for staff, either Clara or Drew. We're in the middle of a comprehensive plan update, and this report is just loaded with zoning recommendations. Is the intention of staff that this board and the village board is going to move ahead with both of these efforts simultaneously? A rezoning of these areas or wholesale changing of the regulations? Because it's a different effort than developing general recommendations that would go into a comprehensive plan that would then recommend that the zoning changes be made in order to make projects like this happen. It's two different efforts. And is there a thought right now, are we going to try and do both? Because we can get really bogged down into the details of these sites. That's way out of scope of a comprehensive plan update.
I think it's a great question, George. I think the answer is, the goal now is to have a conversation, so much a high-level planning conversation, and the sequence would be, do we want to see this? If so, where? And then having the code match that so the planning and zoning can potentially result in the outputs that are desired. So it's here, talk about, do we want this? Where? So which zoning districts, where are other location sites? And then what do we want it to look like so we scale it appropriately? And that gets into the zoning details. The proposal that was, the contract that we have with Opticos talked about, even with the really getting down, let's talk about R5. I think tonight's conversation, this first part of updating the comp plan, the sequence is high level, and then get to amending the code, assuming that's what, not even assuming, but if that's where the conversation takes, that's where we would end up. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, because clearly you're aware, just with the Block 3 example, the enormous amount of time it took the previous, well, some of the members are probably from the original zoning board, that it takes to make or approve a development project.
Yeah, no, exactly.
It will totally drag down progress on the comp plan if we get diverted into trying to do all three of these in the analysis.
Yeah, and because of all those
suitable
things,
regulations.
because of all those things, and because of how Jennifer started off the conversation saying your code is hairy, right? There's a lot of layers to it. So that's why the village, when it said the village's current comprehensive land use plan talks about Block 3, seeing it as transitional residential from the central business district to the R4, which is not easy on such a small, like very small footprint. You talked about how you have this CBD transitioning to detached single family. Most of the time you try to do that with a couple of blocks if you can, but this is 5 parcels. So not easily done. So when the village had a lot of interest in developers looking at the site, came up with that, I would call it a blunt tool with the PMD tool, said, here's some really high-level goals with very few restrictions, knowing that, we will know the right development when it comes through, and we'll have a mechanism to make it facilitate that development. And the one hard metric in there is the height, right? That's the big one that's in there. And there's some setbacks in there, but it's mostly, that's the biggest one. So, but acknowledging all those difficulties, that was the attempt several years ago to try to say if development happens, that's how they would use it. Because as been talked about tonight earlier too, is developers don't like to take risk because it's money and it's time and so that's the whole goal, is try to get the village's vision. What do we want to see it? What do we want to see? Where do we want to see it? And then get the regulations to match so that you can facilitate those outcomes.
Okay, well, I was hoping that was the case because making wholesale zoning changes very quickly is extremely dangerous if you don't understand what you're doing. And as I told you this afternoon when I read this report, I went through the roof and I couldn't even think. You know, some of the changes there, unfortunately, they're out here now in the whole community. Just as an example, for everyone here, the changes that were in print in our report, on the south side of Center, from the police station down to Evanston, there's currently 14 single-family homes. If we took the recommendation of Opticos for R4 as written, there would be 52 units on that same stretch, not counting any ADUs in the backyard. So that's from 14 to 52 in 2 blocks on one side of the street. So we need to be very, very careful about making zoning changes that talk about removing minimum lot sizes, removing FAR standards, so we don't even have any, removing density standards, removing minimum habitable space. I think we have to have some sort of minimum, and maybe 1,050 is too high, but we need, the only reason I'm saying this is we need to be careful. On any site, we need to be careful, and I totally agree that we need to make changes to our codes for specific sites like this. Their Block 1 and the Block 3 site are very unique in terms of the rest of the village, but I am very, very interested also in preserving the character of the village. I'm very interested in protecting existing homeowners near these sites, and we just can't, in a matter of a meeting or two, develop a specific list of zoning changes that are in the comp plan, because I don't think they belong in the comp plan, specific changes they need. So I don't want this report adopted as such.
You don't, I do want to, well, I think it would be helpful, finish your thought, I don't want
No, just that as we move forward with the comp plan part of it, there needs to be general recommendations and acknowledgement that zoning changes are necessary without
Yeah.
saying that, yes, every one of these Opticos recommendations in here, because some of them
There's
have,
a
I started
huge-
analyzing a few, and the numbers I was seeing blew me away.
So 2 things I want to say, if
Yeah,
that's okay.
yeah.
2 things. Part of the reason this report is separate from the comprehend as a standalone document is that there's that small piece at the end of comp plan recommendations. And none of them are the deep in the weeds zoning. You have to understand the zoning. This is a weedy document. Because it's trying to articulate everything that's happening in your zoning. Our recommendations are definitely not to do a wholesale zoning change. If anything, you would start to chip away and say, what are the things we feel comfortable changing? The idea with these reports and how it's happened in other small town communities in particular is that it gives you this picture of where your zoning might be broken, your zoning is the way you implement your comp plan, right? So we're taking that long view, that deep in the weeds view, to understand, okay, we see the changes that are needed to happen. But it starts at that high level comp plan. So I think this is separate. It should not be, our recommendation is not that all the zoning recommendations get brought into the comp plan. But what we see in other communities is the comp plan starts to tell that story of this is where we want a diversity of housing. This is where, and it may just be Block 1 and Block 3, right? And your comp plan can say that. But if you say that in your comp plan, to say, we support multifamily or mixed use on Block 1 and Block 3, part of your comp plan is say, what are the next steps to allowing that? And it's as simple as saying, stating at that comp plan level, that policy, hey, if we want this, if our future land use says this, our zoning likely needs to change. end, right? And what this report is trying to do is give you all those details to then have the conversation to say, okay, if we're just gonna look at CBD, what needs to change there? You could do that without touching R4, R5. I do apologize that this was not intended to go out to the public on art without making changes first that we had with staff. We got very clear direction. You'll see the note in there that said, hey, we looked at R4 because it was on one of these sites. Is this something? We know this wasn't in our scope to make recommendations. We're pretty sure this isn't wanted. Should we remove it? So that was not the intention. The other piece I'll say is that even with zoning changes, you do have to tread lightly. It's a heavy lift. We do this in cities and communities, big and small, over the country. We don't take it lightly, but we do think it's important that when you're making big strategic goals and when you're making comprehensive plan goals, to understand what would have to happen to actually implement those and make them a reality. I think it would be a mistake to say in your comp plan, we see this happen a lot. You make very lofty goals in your comp plan, and it feels great and good, and then there's no way to actually achieve those, right? All this document is trying to do is say, this is sort of your appendix. When you're ready, when you decide where and when you want this housing diversity, right? Let's look at the zoning. But the second piece is really to give you an opportunity to articulate and say, in your comprehensive plan, what we see happen is people say, okay, we did this study, we understand. We don't want multifamily everywhere. We want house scale buildings, and we're okay with them having 3 or 4 units as long as they're in this form and scale. So often, the comp plan says, we want a diversity of housing, and we want to enable cottage courts, we want townhouses, and we want side-by-side duplexes. That's the first step, right? The second piece is to say, in your comp plan, to say, in order to achieve and allow those uses, right, we need to take a form approach to our zoning. Our current zoning is not written with form in mind, with maybe the exception of block 3 and the height. We need to take a look at this because Lake Bluff has a particular character and scale that's appropriate. So we can do both things. We can allow more units and we can regulate and take consideration for that scale and form that exists. So I think that's, new development is gonna be very hard to pencil out. It's very hard to pencil out on a blank parcel. So I would hesitate to say that even in places where we've allowed an ADU by right, allowed 2 units, it is not saying that that makes sense on every existing lot. On very few lots will actually make sense from a feasibility standpoint to redevelop into 2 lots. Most of Lake Bluff is built out. And so that's the type of conversation that we want to have, is saying, okay, maybe we don't need to change the whole zoning, but we do need to change it for block 3 and block 1. So we can write the recommendations in the report to better say, maybe it's not your R5 zoning or CBD zoning doesn't align. Maybe it's just that zoning isn't the right metric for block 3 or block 1. I mean, that's really what it comes down to in Lake Bluff. And so maybe that could be what the comp plan says. That we want this type of housing here and here. We want it on large sites that are in proximity or be very specific. But that's where we see the most success with comp plans, is for them to actually say, we know what has to happen. It's a whole nother process to get that done, but put that out there.
First of all, thanks, Jennifer, for the great thoughts that went into this. I know you've been working on this for a long time, so. I actually had a couple questions about the presentation. Is this the right time to ask about all of that?
Feel free, Mike.
Would that be okay?
That's great.
Test 1 2. Test 1 2. Impedance. So a couple questions, Jennifer. Thank you for everything. So when I saw the title of this presentation about kind of finding middle Lake Bluff, it struck a chord with me. I grew up here when teachers could live in the town and the police officers and the firefighters, and those were grand days, but those days are pretty much gone, right? But what was interesting to me was, some of the conversations we're having, I'm just curious, did you even think about like the sanctuary over in Lake Bluff and what's going on with Knollwood? We've tried to annex Knollwood a couple of times. I mean, it seems like we're, I know this is supposed to be a comprehensive view of do we have housing opportunities for young families to come into town, but I'm just curious if that was even considered, or this is kind of the best way forward. So that would be one question. I don't know if you want to take them one question at a time, totally up to you, but.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We did look at sort of the broader, we had pretty clear directive within our scope to look at key opportunity sites. What we did look at is sort of that, and Tesca started this conversation in the comp plan, which is the right place for that conversation to be. And they'll take a broader look at all of the areas within the comp plan. So we did not look at those. We looked at those for precedent, for price point, for what role is that filling. We did in the last presentation, or the first presentation, look at how many units of duplex exist within Lake Bluff. And we looked at what is the price point, both of the median home value and the average person, right? What is the median income? And are those things aligning, right? And we found they do align, because you have a higher than average income levels and you have higher than average home prices. But like you said, all of these salaries or income levels don't have a place to look to purchase in Lake Bluff. And so that's
Not sure I said that. I was just curious if we had enough volume of housing to.
No,
afford.
I mean,
Yeah.
there's not any community of any size lately that I've looked at that has enough housing. The housing is set, I mean, that's sort of a blanket statement that I'm sure someone could prove me wrong, but in most communities, the demand for housing and the price of new housing is at the forefront of concern. It's why we see cities doing zoning and housing reform and all of those things.
Yeah, and that's another conversation.
That's a
Should
whole
government,
other-
fix that?
I don't know if
or-
I
a
do
lot of
think you have
McMansions
precedent
built
for
there.
Knollwood and things that offer some of those types, but they're not typically on smaller lots. They're further from amenities from Metro, and so those are things that we look at where we would recommend looking first.
And might piggyback on that real quick, Mike? I know it's your first question, but I think to the why, what I think you were asking, why here versus future annexation opportunities or somewhere else in the community?
That's correct. If we're concerned there's not fair housing for people to move into town, I think there's more options than the 3 opportunities.
Oh.
And, have we thought about those? I mean, quite frankly, the sanctuary is a lovely place. I mean, some of the drawings you had, you could have a coffee shop there, and, there could be a lot of really nice, interesting things for that part of Lake Bluff as well, too. So it was just
Yeah,
curious
I
if
think
that was considered.
that was the intent of the large site, was to start to think about how this could look on that size site. You have several, potentially several. There's a whole bunch of conversations about annexation, the extension of your services and infrastructure that need to be part of that conversation, which was partly why we gravitated towards this site in terms of its access and amenities and things like that.
I think, again, just really simply put, 2 of the 3 sites, the Block 1 and Block 3, are sites that the village has long identified as opportunity sites, and the codes don't help make that happen. The other site was, as Jennifer described it, here's a kind of white paper look at a green field that could be a redevelopment where it can be, you can patch and play a lot of different places. But yes, as part of the preliminary feedback and the comprehensive land use plan from community input, I think there's been conversation, well, what about at the intersection of 41 and 176? Presumably at some point there'll be some redevelopment there, but also even there was some comments, I think, about happening in the Waukegan Road corridor, the business corridor. Could that be redeveloped someday when those businesses maybe, you know, these plans, we're talking about like 30-year plans. You know, some of these buildings useful life may come across, and that could be an opportunity as well.
Definitely. Okay, thank you for answering that question. The other question that I had too, and I'll turn it over to some other people that I'm sure have some questions as well about all of this. But I mean, I appreciate the need to develop and want to look at develop, but have we even looked at open land opportunities at 11-acre site? I mean, has the village even thought about other things besides just development? I mean, I think as a homeowner here, I mean, anytime, you know, supply and demand is supply and demand. And, you know, you start opening up these houses, and in my own humble opinion, I just looking at what happens in Evanston and Glenview, you know, people buy those houses, they VRBO them, they are still going to Florida, and I mean, are we really accomplishing senses of community and things like that by some of these plans? And I thought the community pretty obviously voted against it. The 3 times Block 3's come up to make that big housing density. So I guess final comment, I'm just a little surprised and disappointed we keep trying to fit this conversation back in now under the guise of the good work that you're trying to do. But
No, that's a fair,
yeah, thank you.
I think that's a fair, I mean, I'll let Drew and Claire, I think that's a fair question. I think it's the conversation of if providing housing choice is important, is one of the strategic goals that the community voted on. I don't know what, you know, I wasn't part of those conversations, but if that's something you're stating in your strategic plan goal, then I think it's important to answer the question of where that's appropriate and what, right? So if it's not Block 3, where is it? Is it a greenfield site? That's your other options, right? There's limited, you know, so it's either or. It's sort of either you say not a goal, or you say it's a goal. Where would that make sense?
I mean,
how do we offer that?
I mean, is the goal to have a empty bank there and parking that nobody is using?
Right.
Is that our goal in our community? I mean, I feel like, I think it'd be interesting to do a cost evaluation on how much the property cost. And, you know, because there's always a red line, right? There's always a number that a contractor will say, it's not worth it. You know, and now we know it's not worth it because we have a lot of different opinions on 2 levels or 3 levels or what's going on. But I think a contractor will not engage with obviously with some of our restrictions in zoning, but the height in parking is certainly driving the contractors out. But I think it'd be really interesting to know, like, how much does that land cost and how much is it to build? How many units would they have? You know, and maybe have that dialogue with the contractor or builders in town that would do it. And also, I was curious, we have 3 levels just down the street.
Yeah.
And your evaluation was keeping it at 2. Were you hesitant because of
Only because
the noise?
Only based of past conversations that we knew had happened.
Right.
And it didn't seem appropriate to have that same conversation to try to push 3 stories when there had clearly been a conversation around that. I think it's important to continue that conversation of, listen, are we okay with Block 3 as is? If nothing changes, is that what we want as a community? If not, if we say, no, we want something there, then you have to have that conversation to say, no developer can make 2 stories or 1 stories pencil out. So it's a choice to be had, right? Or you're saying we want a 1-story bank. We're allowing that. That's what you'll get. That's probably the most viable product on that block right now, right?
Jill-
And so it's sort of setting that standard.
I was gonna say, Jill, one of the things that you should know is that Jennifer, as part of her work for the village, she talked about it and hinted to it that she's having conversations with developers. One of the things she's trying to do is to take some of these concepts and say, does this pencil out? Will this make money? Is this a viable project? So she's starting to have those conversations. So when you come back, that question should get answered. That's our goal, is if the development community works with us, as they've said they will, to say, these aren't just pretty pictures, this can be built.
That's the hope when you put a program like this and we say, this is getting you this number of units with this much parking. The idea is that these can be taken to a developer or a local contractor and builder, and they can run a very quick pro forma and say, not enough, or too much. I mean, we got preliminary conversations, that's what's sort of in our scope, but the idea is that we can give those to developers and they can run that pro forma and give you feedback to have with the conversation, or with the community. Yes, thanks for being patient.
Everything seems to be geared towards ownership of whatever it is. And all you have to do is go 3 or 4 miles in any direction and find out that thousands of units are being built and not a one of them is a condo. And I think that if we got our head in the sand, if we don't think, if we can expand out and have some, because nobody can afford to buy a house anymore, almost anywhere. And the young kids that are trying to buy a house, or people that are my age that need to buy something smaller, can't afford it. And so rental seems to be the way to go.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is, I haven't heard anything about that kind of because those are smaller generally than.
To make that, yeah, and I mentioned this in the developer feedback. It's one thing that we state with missing middle is that there are types that are aligned just because of the financial mechanisms that you mentioned, that there are types that align better with rental, and there are types that naturally align better with homeownership. We advocate for both. There is a tremendous need for rental. We haven't heard that as something that the Village of Lake Bluff wants or needs necessarily, but we know when we look nationwide, when we look regionally, when we look county, the number of renters is on the uptrend. The number of home ownerships is on the downside, is declining. And that's one of the feedback we got from the developers is like, if you can figure out a rental product that works. And I think that is one of the premise of why we started pushing and looking at missing middle housing. Because when you go to rental, there's a huge need for rental. Most of the products that are built today are large apartment complexes because of the economies of scale, because you can provide a lot of smaller units, repeated over and over again, you keep your numbers down. Not everybody wants to live in a long corridor building. A long corridor building doesn't fit into the character of many towns and villages. So how can we offer that rental product in smaller buildings that fit within the community? That's sort of the whole point of many of these types. But there is a clear alignment with some of the multiplexes, the 4 and up, that offer those rental options more readily. But like the developers we talked to locally, that's shifting, where they're trying to figure out products for townhouses that are a little bit smaller. They're just two-story townhouses, but that they're renting them, and that's the majority of our projects recently are actually with developers saying, I want to do this product, but I want to make it rental. So I think that's something to be aware of and to be ahead of, because that's definitely a demand for that.
I'm not suggesting that's right in the middle of downtown, but I think that we're ignoring the possibility if we start looking at land. And some of the apartment rentals are just, they're just awful as far as architectural.
Yes.
Blanks on the landscape. Other ones, even though you may not agree with it, but some of the things in Libertyville that are taking place in Hawthorne are kind of dynamic, and those are going to attract the younger people. Now, they're not cheap either. They're $3,000 or $4,000 a month.
Yeah. I think that's the point you're at. I think you are ahead of the curve on most places. Most places that we go to are in such dire need to produce hundreds and thousands of units because of the housing shortage. You're not there yet, and you're a small community. But I do think you should be ready for many of these large sites to say, okay, if we need to provide more housing, what are our options? Right? Is it a large apartment, garden-style apartment on that 11-acre site? Is that what you want? Make sure your zoning aligns with that. If it's not, right, there are other ways to allow for that variety of products you're not describing in your zoning whether it has to be rental or homeownership, but you do want to think about that and think about what product types, what housing types you want to see. And who are they serving, right?
Jennifer,
guess-
question.
Go ahead.
So one of the comments by the developer was about the PMD or PRD,
PRD, yeah.
and eliminating the 6-acre minimum. We've had, in my experience being on the board, we've had two opportunities for planned developments, and neither of them have panned out. In your experience, do those development agreements work well? Or is that something that we shouldn't even be trying to use in the future?
Yeah, I think I said this in the conversation. In most places, they don't, in many cities are eliminating them because the amount of resources that it takes for staff to implement them and follow them, it's also really resource intensive for the developer, right? They have to come up with a whole set of rules. They have to come up with a whole plan that's phased. I think the heyday for that is sort of harder to make sense of, right? Fewer developers are in it for the long term, so they're harder to track. They're also harder to get across because it means many public meetings to try to get consensus. So they're really costly from a developer's perspective. So those are the limitations, and I think those are some of the concerns when I think you would have to look at, one, you have to look at the sites that you have and how they would likely be developed. We're seeing more and more developers be interested in smaller 2 to 3 or 4 acre sites than we ever have before. So many of the large developers of apartment complexes or even single family housing developments 5 years ago wouldn't look at a site that was under 15 acres or 10 acres. It wasn't even on their radar. Even the largest home builders are now coming to us and saying, the market has shifted so much that now we're interested in that 5 and under site, right? Because we can't make the numbers work on bigger sites. So I think I'm not sure that answered your question totally. I still think in Lake Bluff, because it's such a site-by-site basis of what you want to allow, that our PRD could work. But I think you have to be eyes wide open of what you're requiring of the developer, and also what you're saying, and this is what goes back to that comp plan of what you're saying we want there, and just being very clear. Because right now, the future of those sites is not very clear. I mean, I think in many of the cases, it's single family, it's driving an outcome that's sort of single family estate lots. Vast majority of this one was institutional, which is sort of unclear. Is that, do you need more public facilities? Is that likely? Is that the place you want them? So those are the questions to sort of be, if it's not, what type of residential do you want to see there? And being clear about that can help make the PRD tool more successful. That was a long answer to.
Answered it, thank you.
Just curious, on the infill, smaller block 1, block 3 type, what are you seeing successfully work parking-wise? How far off are we? I mean, I know we're not able to do it because of what we have.
Yeah.
How far off?
I think if you, what we've seen work in other communities, other suburban communities, is sort of that minimum 1 per unit.
1 per unit, okay.
I think that on block 3, or block 1, excuse me, that might be different. But you'd have to get really creative. You have Metro right there, you have parking, right? Not every buyer, not every renter is gonna say, I want a place with no cars, but you're really talking about 5 units. Can you find 5 people that are like, yeah, I could live near downtown Lake Bluff and the Metro and be okay. I mean, but I think the reality is, in some places, right, one space per unit is more acceptable. We heard pushback from the developer on that even. So I'm not saying that's easy. But I think the reality is, in most places in Lake Bluff, in 98% of Lake Bluff, you're offering a product that has 2 spaces per unit. You can, find that type elsewhere in your community. A viable product for those 1 and 2 person households, especially those 1 person households that are growing, and you can look at some of your demographics, a 1 space on-site is reasonable, and we're seeing it work in other places.
Great, thank you.
Jennifer, I can certainly appreciate your passion and the passion of your firm with respect to this type of initiative. But I guess the underlying question that I have, and I've had it probably for a considerable period of time, is what's in the best interest of the community and what does the community actually really want?
Yeah.
Because we went through Block 3, we probably went through that 3 or 4 times in the last decade or 15 years. We had some, I think, very, very potentially viable proposals, but the density would have been maybe 5 units. And that's supposed to be like a transition parcel. And I don't want to be critical of your proposal,
Oh, you can be, yeah,
But,
that's the point.
when I look at 12, 10, 15 units in a transition neighborhood, I'm thinking, that's not necessarily Lake Bluff.
Yeah, that's fair. That's a conversation to be had. I think it comes down to that conversation of 3 or 4 or 5 units is probably not gonna be feasible. And that's what we'll be able to test, but
And is
No.
that feasible
for a developer to
for a
build it
developer to build financially?
financially.
Okay.
I think what you could get there is 5 townhouses, and the land cost of that site will be so high that those will be $1 million townhouses. From an urban perspective, that probably would be a great use of this block. From a housing perspective, that's the question to answer as Lake Bluff. I don't think that 4 or 5 units will be financially feasible. We will ask developers, we'll have that conversation. So that's where this push and pull. I understand that this is sort of pushing the max of what could go on that block, but what is the alternative, right?
Well, but, one of the critical factors is protecting the individual rights and investments of the individual property owners in and around that same neighborhood. And
So is it, well, yeah, no, I get that. That's a concern we hear a lot. In most circumstances, I think Lake Bluff is an incredible example of transitioning very quickly from your core to an incredible single-family neighborhood. Right? You do that incredibly well in a limited amount of space. That's why I think people love to live in the historic area of Lake Bluff, because you have that immediate access and you're in a single-family neighborhood. In most instances where we see multifamily or missing middle, property values go up, because the demand for this type of unit is so high, especially in smaller communities, especially in stronger markets like Lake Bluff, that when you keep a 2-story house scale character, the property values, the business, it helps them thrive. That's what we see in other places.
which communities in close proximity to Lake Bluff have you had some successful initiatives?
Yeah, that's fair. So, I mean, we can look at successful examples of smaller towns that have, the downtown Main Street all along the Metro stop, right, and provide housing nearby. it fills up really quick. We haven't done any projects, we're not developers, in the area. We have, I think we showed the 2 projects, in both South Bend, Indiana, not too far away, as well as, in Omaha, outside of Omaha, Nebraska, right? And these types are immediately rented and the property values go up and they support sort of more local, amenities nearby. I mean, in South Bend, they've been building duplexes and sixplexes, more recently, and they're a much weaker market, but it's a needed housing choice, and it's escalating the, you know, I mean, it is improving the property values in those neighborhoods.
I mean, I'm not trying to be critical, but
No, you're fine.
we're a lot different community than South Bend. I
Oh,
spent a few
yeah, and
years in
that's-
South Bend, and I like South Bend. It's a great community, but
No, you're a very different market. I mean, we've seen cottage courts in very wealthy, higher-end markets, in the most high-end market in California, in, you know, Benton Harbor, Michigan, right? There's a huge demand for those products. So, I mean, I think we know the success. There are very few there are very few examples in our region.
appreciate
And that's part of that conversation with the developers. No one wants to be first. But then you talk to the developer of Glenview, and it was like, nobody did townhouses. And then I did them, and now everyone wants a tuck under townhouse, throughout the community. And so it is tricky. I mean, there's no, but we are seeing the demand for these types.
Well, I think around here, even Libertyville to some degree, you know, and I think that's one that we could maybe even find out maybe more about and such. But Libertyville does have,
Yeah.
you know, School Street, and if you look at some of the ones there that have very much focused on scale, and mixed it right within sort of the walking district and the heritage district and stuff, so maybe there's some examples there.
Yeah, we've worked with the School Street developer before and talked to him on several projects. I mean, I think it takes a different approach, no doubt, but all of the demographic shifts, all of the preference studies from the Realtors Association, from every planning, from DePaul, you know, housing studies are all saying there's a huge demand for this product type. But that's sort of, you know, I think you have the opportunity to define what that is. If it's, we want cottage courts, I think you could sell those all day in your community. And if you just made that zoning change to allow cottage courts somewhere, right? It's an opportunity to provide a different housing option that I think would fit with the demographic trends we see in Lake Bluff. But that's what we hope you'll use this to say, oh, we don't need all these types. We want this type. How do we let our zoning allow just that? Yeah.
So my guess here is in taking a wide-angle view that in the context of the comp plan, so we're accepting the fact that the different sites may actually end up having different goals.
Yes.
And in a sense, we're trying to apply the higher density role, let's say, to Block 3. At the same time, we're looking at a higher density role for Block 1 and the Jawa site.
Mm-hmm.
From a pragmatic standpoint, and I've had some experience with Block 3. I almost wonder if you've made the comment you could probably do 5 townhouses there. And I think many of us have some sense of what the property value is. And yes, that's going to run the bill up. But anecdotally, I know 2 displaced folks who would move into that $1 million townhouse over there next week if it was available. Given the
Yeah.
notion of diversity of housing and accepting that at some point in time, some of these sites, we can't force fit a lot of this in, and accept that some site may in fact not satisfy the missing middle.
Yeah.
It may satisfy another missing aspect, because when we talk about expanding housing in Lake Bluff, we're not talking about carte blanche, and this isn't you know, we're not trying to absolute volume. That's not the goal here.
Right, right.
We're really trying to craft. We're really trying to craft something that will work for Lake Bluff.
Yeah.
And so now you think that we need to get back to the notion that it's acceptable to have one set of standards here and one set of standards in, let's say, at the Jawa site. And in a way, I guess I'm not getting that vibe. It almost seems like we're set on, well, you know, how do we fit 15 units on block 3, which is, you know, that ship is, I think, has sailed.
Sure.
And so accept that, and maybe it's time to move on. And, you know, in a way, we're kind of winnowing or fine-tuning the alternatives, the practical alternatives that we have. And they're all 3 very unique locations, which you pointed out at the very outset. But somehow or another, I'm getting the sense that we're trying to come back and remake this as if they're all in some way have some commonality. And I'm not sure they do.
Sure. Appreciate that, yeah.
So like this exhibit here.
Yeah.
15 units on block 3. I think part of the question we're trying to get answered, like I mentioned earlier, is this, has that already passed? Is that gone? Is that doable? And I think we're still trying to find that. We don't know the answer to that yet.
Well,
We don't know.
I have an opinion, but.
But I think that's, is that 2 stories or 2.5?
This is all 2.
2 stories.
Yeah, we've only shown 2, and this is 15 units, and I think, yeah, the hope for this is that it solicits that conversation.
You'd shown that earlier slide on the right side, you had all the hurdles that you have to get over, like the land cost.
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
all
yeah.
that. Does it pencil out? Don't know yet, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I do think, I mean, to your point, I think that that is a choice you have to say, and we in the report, the whole first half is sort of what are the types, right? And then, you know, you can and should write your zoning to describe the forms that you want to see. So if it's townhouses on this, but I would argue that it's probably not one single house, which is what your zoning is currently saying you want.
Yeah.
But that's not for me to answer.
Yeah,
either,
but to your
so.
point, I think it's incredibly important that we're careful about how we craft this. Because when we considered block 3 the first time around, or maybe
Yeah.
it was the second, had we followed the zoning, the negatives that were being perceived would have been more negatively impactful
Sure.
on the neighbors than the proposal that was being routed through the PRD in terms of setback, in terms of shadow, and for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
And that was not widely discussed.
Sure.
And so we really have to be careful what we choose and how we choose what goes on here if we're willing to say we're not going to look so much at PRDs anymore, because what the unintended consequences of even what we have today are pretty high.
Yeah.
And so even looking at what we have is going to take some machination here by this body, in my opinion, because we could have a real negative outcome, again, with unintended consequences.
I mean, I agree with everything you said, is that I think that's why we do this. We tried not to look at those past proposals as much. I mean, we did, and we saw, but we took note of all the things that were the sort of hard stop. We know there's the website. we try to do this from a somewhat agnostic standpoint of to say, this is what your zoning allows. This is what we know is sort of a, achievable products. And lay that out there to say, you want those two things to align. Your zoning wants to say what you want on that site. And so I agree wholeheartedly with what you said, that like, you're trying to avoid those unintended outcomes. You're trying to avoid another battle because the zoning is so unclear about what you can and can't do that it's just sort of, does that, so I agree with you if that's, and I do think there are different considerations, so I apologize if that didn't come through, that we were treating the 3 different sites differently. I do think you can set very different standards, and if you look closely at the 11-acre site, right, it's predominantly cottage or duplex type. I think there's 2 actual bigger buildings that are still house scale, as opposed to these, which are larger scale, missing middle. That makes sense.
One last thing. You'd made a couple statements. One is that there's a practical minimum for the number of units that can be affordably condoed.
Yeah.
Okay, and you also suggested there is a practical limit or minimum for the number of units that a particular could be in a rental before it became an impracticality to manage and administer. It almost sounds though like we're sort of in that dilemma. So
Yeah. Oh, I mean, this is the whole prep. This is why we call it missing, because it's tough. Because once you have 4 rental units or 6 rental units, there's a property management cost. There's, however small, there's a shared common space, and all that stuff takes money for a developer to do. There's not a lot of property management companies that will take on 4 units, right? And so you're looking at all these options for property management that want 100 units or 200 units, and you're saying, I just need help with 4. That's why we talk a lot about the duplex, right? More manageable, or cottage courts. So yes, that's.
But we keep showing 4 unit and multi-unit, and if they're not practical, why are we even showing them?
That is the question that we want to ask, because they're providing that housing choice. They are viable from a cost per square footage standpoint. They make a lot of sense, and they're filling a need. They're filling a need in our housing market, in all of the demographic shifts that we see. You do, and that's one of the barriers we talk a lot about. That it's probably not going to be your large, typical apartment complex builder. This isn't going to make sense for their performa. It does make sense for the local builder or developer who now, what we see a lot of in communities is the single-family home buyer or builder who's doing not the big scale developments, but in their community. They want to be in their community. They can't make a single-family house make sense anymore. Because to make it make sense, they have to build really big and get as much money as they can on that lot. And that's not the demographic shifts that we're seeing. There's fewer and fewer people in every community that can afford or want that size house. And so what we're seeing is home builders recognizing this dilemma and saying, okay, how can I build a smaller product at a higher cost per square foot? Or how can I start to dip my toe into 2 units, right? Because this starts to make sense. We do have to figure out the property management and the financing piece of it. But those tools are there, they just haven't been tapped into, right? You can build up to 3 units with a single family mortgage. It's the same construction type, right? You're not having to do elevators. It isn't even until 4 that you have to do fair housing and accessibility, even though you should. It's those types of opportunities that just because they haven't been done, developers are looking for that next model because that large house isn't making much sense anymore. So, but it's very difficult.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Well, you said, I don't, you stopped it, you mentioned 5 townhomes on it, and you said, well, it'd be over $1 million. Like, that's a deal breaker.
No, yeah.
Why is that?
Oh, no, I think,
So, I mean, I would just be curious, if that's a deal breaker, was there a limit that these have to be affordable housing and it's $500,000, $600,000 as a
No.
price point line?
no,
Because I like what, and I think Gary brought that up too, there's been these developments in the past, and I'm relatively new, I've been in the community for 5 years. But I'm not opposed to having $1 million places here, and I think that would be great on lot 3. If it's a townhouse, which would involve changing some of the setbacks and requirements for it, so be it, but why is missing middle being forced onto that, again, kind of what you brought up? And that's how I feel, is kind of, we're trying to fit that into that, which that's probably not the right kind of construction or development to put on that lot.
no, I appreciate that. So to clarify, I mean, I think you can build those and they will sell, and that it would be, there's a good urban project. Like, it would contribute to the walkability and the environment and the housing choice. Why we advocate, well, we don't advocate against that. I think it's a type that's needed, and really in demand. So there are many worse things that could happen on that site than that. I think why we advocate for the middle scale and the idea of missing middle is because when we look at the rising cost of housing and the income rates of folks, even at that upper tier, fewer and fewer people in your community can afford that $1 million home. And so we're trying to match those two things up.
I think Lake Bluff, in my mind, I looked at Lake Forest before I bought here, and I thought actually Lake Bluff on the taxes were a little bit high, but the cost of the housing were actually a bit more affordable. So if there are people that are coming from Lake Forest that would like to be in the downtown area, we've expanded that. So it's not just
I think you
Lake
could do
Bluffers
that.
that are looking for a new home, but we might be bringing in more people. And those new homes, or even if it is a townhome at that price point, may be a reason why we bring more people here.
I think you could do that all day on pretty much every vacant lot you have and sell a townhouse all day long. Yeah, I mean, and that's not for me to say that that's wrong or right, but when we look at the demographic trends, that's why we say this is a void. There's no, right, what product can fill and fit this match, and where would you want it? But no, I think townhouses are a very valid option, and I do think that they would be successful here.
So how does that fall into then the board and staff to decide what would be best? Is that community outreach then, say we would like to see townhomes there versus missing middle? How do we go about that?
I think,
Clear, there are townhouses in the missing middle report, so when we
I'm
say.
saying that 5 properties
Yeah.
there at that $1 million+ range, if that would be something that
So
would
in the report, it shows townhouses and say, if you want to do townhouses, you need to change your minimum lot size and your setbacks to this. Right, so that's what we hope the option is. You can look at this palette of housing, because we include townhouses in the missing middle.
But it's kind of a cluster. I mean, it's like it's a bunch of homes. I don't know what the smallest,
Yeah, if you could,
the smallest development was, but it wasn't 5 units. When lot 3 had some townhomes, it was
The
more
block-
a mixed property, some higher density.
Yeah,
development.
and-
I'm saying 5 townhomes.
yeah,
5
if you go to
lots.
the other one on block 3, you know, essentially that's what, that B building, those are the size of townhouses.
like walk-ups,
I mean, those are what those are. That's a 2-story townhouse footprint. We're showing them as live work because this is your CBD zone, and so it asks for mixed use. But those could be, that would be what 4 townhouses look like on that site. Just to give you a sense of scale, that those 4 buildings here, sorry. These 4 and these 3 are townhouses. The form and scale of them are 2-story townhouses. So just to get a sense of how many you could fit, you could do bigger, you could have them be tuck under, they'd be a little bit deeper for a tuck under type, but you could do those all across and you could
in that particular proposal, does that separate the current CBD zone property and the R4 property, the two R4 parcels?
This would, sorry, in this,
So in this proposal right here, so the townhouses
our
the-
CBD,
is that the CBD
yeah, and then, the-
property, and then the two other
C and E
C and
are
E
R-
are
yeah.
the R4 properties? Okay.
yeah, and this assumes the PMD tool, would be utilized, would likely be utilized. So I'm not saying that that R4 should be this. I think R4 is probably not the right zoning for that end of block 3. But I think that house scale buildings or townhouses would be appropriate on that site, so.
I'd like to just highlight one thing, or two things that Mark said, and something I've been arguing for as long as I've been part of this conversation, that diversity of housing doesn't automatically mean affordable housing, right? I mean, and that has been an assumption and a misconception that our community has had, and that's just not something that we can even contemplate on this site particularly. I mean, maybe some other sites in the village, but this site is totally inappropriate for any thought of affordable housing.
And we try to distinguish that we're not talking about affordable
With a big A, I understand that.
Or even-
But relatively, yeah,
relative to we're talking about it relative to the single-family house
right. I just want to make it clear that that's not what we're talking about.
yes,
In
correct.
diversity of housing it does not automatically mean affordable housing.
Yeah,
On Mark's second point, he said he's got two people in town that would buy one next week. I could think of probably a dozen or more people that would buy $1 million townhouse, and that's what I've heard that people want. If any of I grew up in town, I've got a lot of my parents' friends who are looking for that product.
Yeah.
And if they could find it right here, they would buy it in an instant. And so that's the current market that I think we need to serve, is our current families. Yeah, townhouses. Townhouses, I think, would be an ideal thing for that site. And, that's what our current residents want. I know that your graphs and your projections show that we need to make smaller and smaller scale, smaller price, but our current residents need something there. They need a townhouse or a condo even, but they can afford the $1 million. Maybe in 40, 50 years when, the homeownership rate plummets to like that of Europe, then yeah. But right now, we've got a current market that demands something that we don't currently have, and I think that's where we really need to focus, on this block specifically.
I think all of these buildings that you see here could be townhouses. The two things, one of the reasons we didn't do townhouses on C and E were because they're a more urban product. What we heard from the developers, you likely have to go to 3 stories to get those to make sense, to get 2 cars. I think in this site you could take up parking, but not many people necessarily want to face onto a parking lot. But you could do it. You could make all of these townhouses, and I think they would be a really great addition. They are a more urban product, and so when we talk about transitioning to R4, some of the sort of mansion-style apartments have more residential character than townhouse. And then there's that question of accessibility, right? Because they're upper floor, typically aging adults, retirees. My parents just sold a townhouse because they hit 70 and it's too much stairs, right? So that's something to think about too when we look at the demo. But we could draw this as townhouses and it would be awesome. Your zoning doesn't allow that. With the setback.
And in defense, we tried, and that's why we went with the PRD, right? We tried to be flexible with the project and not change zoning.
You mean the PMD?
PMD for that site, yeah.
Because the PRD isn't applicable to this
Right.
site because of the acreage.
'Cause
But the
it's
PMD
yeah.
is, but it relies on your base zoning. So that's what we ran into when we were testing, is that it's still, well, it triggers the CBD, but the setbacks and things like that were very unclear. So but yeah.
I guess my concern, and I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on Block 3 anymore, but you're looking at
We can't help.
22 units, and I don't know what the square footage per unit is, but it's rather minimal, and I'm not exactly sure I'm not exactly sure Lake Bluff would want that density.
They're about 1,000 square foot
Well,
minimum for those units.
Yeah.
And that can be that's a,
I mean, it's all personal
Two-bedroom.
preference, but that's a lot of
yeah,
density.
no, that's, and that's the idea with these types is that that could be 4,000 square units, or it could be 1,500 square foot units, right? It's that, it fits in that form and scale that you want.
And we said open-minded. You did say that in the beginning, you know, trying to be open-minded. I think if we had a developer and we could work with setbacks and we could work with outdoor space and trees along it and proper materials and have it meet the high standards that we require, I don't think, you know, we're assuming a bad outcome. We can also assume that it could be a good outcome by creating a tight, you know, conversation with the developer or an open conversation with developers, but yet put that into the zoning or the architecture review board or whatever. We can work together to make sure that whatever is built is something that we can all be proud of, right? I mean, that's also the goal. Landscaping is important.
Yeah.
And the market has significantly changed since we had that last conversation on Block 3. Right? So,
Right.
you know, the economics could have changed. So,
And I'm intrigued of the cottage clusters too, though, if we really think about it. I mean, I agree, townhomes, $1 million, no problem. People want to live in this community. I'm all in favor of something like that, but we also have the young people that are trying to get into this community as well and can't afford $1 million. So could a cottage cluster or a little small community like that be a starting point or an end point? Because I'm not doing stairs. I don't know about you guys.
Yeah, I mean, the
Need an
cottage
elevator.
clusters, the block, which, I mean, seems really appropriate for any of your sort of large sites that are embedded in existing neighborhoods. Those are typically maybe 1.5 story cottages. I mean, I think those alone are actually even more in demand than townhouses, what we see, because they sort of offer both. And they're similar to townhouses, and they're easier to finance than some of the multi-unit buildings. And so I think those are, I mean, you could see just doing the 3 cottage clusters on Block 11 and leaving the rest open space. And I think that would be incredible and a really needed and highly sought after product in your market.
You talked about doing this pro forma for this block. Have you established a dialogue yet with the owners? I think there's 2 owners now, isn't there?
Yes, on this block, yes. Now
Are
so that is not in our scope to do the performance. In our scope, it is to start that conversation, to put the program out there and to start the conversation with developers to understand what are your typical construction costs, what are your typical products. So that's the conversation that we're having with developers. I think that it is what we often see these opportunity sites used for, is to continue to connect, you know, your local developers and builders better than I do, to connect and say, what does this look like? The developer is gonna run those numbers, they're shifting every day, but they can run those pretty quickly to say, oh, we've done the work to lay it out, to site plan it and say, all right, you've got, 7,000 foot units in this size building. Does that work for you? Would you build that?
Well,
So,
you have to know the land cost, though.
yeah, that's part of the performa.
The performer can assume that if the land cost is no more than this, then that project's worth.
Yeah, what they do is when
We had 2 developers that took a really deep dive and probably both spent more than 6 figures analyzing this, and both of them were insistent that they had to be 3 stories,
Yeah.
which the immediate neighborhood vehemently objected to. And what has changed? I can't imagine that the land costs have gone down. Do we even know if the owner of the bank property even wants to sell? He has had a for rent sign up there for years and never, the for sale sign has gone.
Every conversation I've had with him is he wants to sell and he wants it to be residential.
So, well, that's good that he wants to sell.
So typically when we do
Funny that he
these,
doesn't have a for sale sign up though.
typically when we do these, it's the developers or the economists that we will have do the performas. I mean, they take comps. They look at typical land prices in your market and they speculate on what that would likely go for that lot. And then they know the construction cost, they know the soft cost, they know their typical return of investment, and they run the numbers there. What you want to avoid, right, is a developer or the property owner going behind the table, doing this whole set of plans that are sunk, and then coming and saying, this is what I want to do. That's a sunk cost for them. And it's very hard for a developer to say, this makes sense, this 3 stories, and just lob off that top floor, right? They can do that really quickly to say that our numbers don't work anymore. But what we want to do is sort of find that range and get feedback to say, oh, you could do less. I could make this work for less. I don't have those answers, but we want to start that conversation. And I think it's the right role for the leaders in your village to say, and put that out there, say, we understand you might need more units. Can we achieve that in 2 stories without giving you that 3rd story? Because we know that's something the community cares about. That's sort of what we want to have happen.
What the village can control on that list of things that, you know, the expense side of the ledger to do developments, what does the village control? Impact fees. You
Yeah.
know, in this case, we're not a landowner, but we are in Block 1, right? The village really wanted to see something, they can, you know, we can take what we paid for the for the property years ago, or we can, you know, we want to participate and we'll lessen the market, you know. So the village has a role in economic development, impact fees, connection fees, public amenities. That's where the village can help make or break projects.
Jennifer, and I'm sure it wouldn't be just the members of this commission, if we had exactly what we want on that lot, would that make this process easier? Then we can at least go to a developer and be like, and say, would this work? I mean, is that something that other communities have done?
What we see is that's really enticing for a developer. If you say, we've done the back end work to get the community, this is what the community wants. You're coming into a welcoming environment. Will you do this? That puts you in the driver's seat. And it's a huge cost savings for them.
Removing risk from the developer means time through the chute is a lot shorter.
If you say
the
you don't have to
plan and the zoning match, home run.
And I'm not suggesting that we would you know, hire an architect to draw blueprints and plans for this, but if we say we want a row of townhomes on part of the block and, you know, a small cluster of cottages on the other part, just for example.
Anecdotally, in every situation where the city has said, this is what we want, we've got the community on board, we've done the work to get community on board. You're not gonna show up to an outraged, you know, we know this is what, you'll never get everybody to agree.
Jennifer, maybe the simplest way to describe it is briefly tell them what Opticos did in South Bend.
Which one? The pre-approved?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the zoning and then the pre-approved, but we drew plans for a duplex for a cottage.
City was the client. Give us
The city was
6
the
plans.
client. We vetted them with developers. The city vetted them with the community. And said, we're offering these plans for free in these zones. We've changed the zones. We've got the design. This is a very weak market, mind you. The gap does not make sense for appraisal, right? These are selling for very low. in the first year, they've built six of them. That's more development they've seen of this type ever, outside of their existing core. And they've got a developer who put in for 37 scattered site infill using these plans. Nobody has resisted because they see what they look like. They knew exactly that they fit on the zoning, they fit on the existing lots, and it's a huge cost savings. So that nonprofit developers are doing them. Because they make sense from that standpoint. In other communities, it's really, if you say, we've changed the zoning, we've done the community outreach, and that's like half of the developer's soft cost, right there. And in this market where it's tough to make things work, that's pretty enticing. And I think that's what we encourage leaders and the PCZBA to say, this is our role, to have this community conversation. It's not my role. I can draw it, and I understand buildings, and I understand these types and the but it's your role to say, what do we want to see there? And how do we make this viable for a developer and get our community on board or listen to our community? That's part of the comp plan process. That's part of this process, is to have those conversations before you get a proposal that no one likes. And that's real money and time.
And I think that's where we ran into a roadblock in the past, is we did not give enough specificity of what exactly we want, right? We basically said, we've got this site, we want to develop it, but, you know, bring us your ideas, and those ideas cost money. If we can say more specifically, no, this is what we want, let's do it, then I think that's a conversation worth having on our part.
Jennifer, I think we have somebody online that wants to comment.
Yeah, we do have a question online that says, can the school system support this many additional families in town? And I know you can't answer that specifically, but maybe if you could talk about kind of the demographics of.
So we get this question a lot. It's a concern when you start to allow more units on a lot, and it's a justified one. The reality is, when we look at take block 1, or like take block 3, for example, sorry to keep focusing on it, it's a really hard one not to, right? When you look at this, you're talking about, at the high level, we're talking about somewhere from 12 to 22 units. Most of these are gonna be 2-bedroom. The demographics shift to 1 and 2 person households, aging, or starter homes. That's not a big demand. Those demographics are not a big demand on your school system, but they do offer really good property tax value, right? You're generating way more revenue on this site than you were before, and part of that goes to your schools. So it's that conversation of, that's an understandable, especially if you were to talk about going into the neighborhoods and allowing more units. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, on these, your most urban blocks, allowing 1 and 2-bedroom units to fill a void in your market. That void aligns with 1 and 2-bedroom households, aging baby boomers, or not even on this, but on, you know, single person young professionals. They're not a big drain on your school system. They are bringing a lot more revenue to your community.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Any other comments from the commissioners or from the public?
Thank you all for your thoughts and their time. I know it's been a long night. Appreciate those who have stuck it out. But we appreciate having this conversation.
And I think we'll have additional conversations, Jennifer, because it's a very complicated and critical discussion. But we just, in the long run, have to do what's right for the community in the long haul. And we have to hear from the community.
Yeah,
Yeah, but thank you very much.
thank you.
One question for Drew. Clara, has the village board talked about becoming more proactive with these sites? I mean, has there been any, is anybody walking in the door asking about the 11-acre site by Jawa? Have we talked to the C. McKee building owner? Because they own everything but the tiny little old gas station footprint, right? They even own the lot behind. So without that, do we even know if the owner of that property is interested in going into some sort of deal? Because those kind of questions need to be asked.
Yeah, can you go to the block 1 slide really quick, Lara?
Yep.
So the answer is, yes, we've had conversations with them, and they are those types of development, they're 8-unit building, great steady investment income, solid. They talked about this when we shared this with Jennifer before she started her work, is, you know, they were interested in maybe reskinning it to match if something happened, but they said, keep us in the loop. If it makes sense, we'll participate. But, the village did that missing middle housing competition 5 years ago now?
Oh, more than that.
It's shocking.
Yeah, like 8.
But nobody jumped on that. Nobody came and said, hey, I saw this, I'm interested. That didn't happen. Not sure why. Again, it seems like a great location, you know, relative to the train, downtown, lake, everything, but just not a lot of interest yet. But like Jennifer says, these smaller sites are getting more and more interesting, and infill, it's, you know, with our community, people, I presume, will want to develop there someday. But, so yes, we've had conversations with them about this. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we practically give away the parking over there on the train lot from the good old days when,
Well,
you
and
know,
that-
we were hoping from what,
That seems to
can't
be
the
a
village,
layup. That seems
can't
to
the
be a layup,
village,
right?
yeah, offer, because parking is one of the huge hurdles, according to Opticos, for this site. Can we not see if we can structure a deal where the parking is, for the most part, is across the street?
Yeah.
That's what we've talked about. That seems
I think that's the
logical
only,
and
yeah, that's the
realistic.
only way we can make sense of
And then let
this
the development
0.5.
community know that
Yeah.
We're flexible.
we wouldn't,
The developer, had-
Flexible options.
Is that the first recommendation or coming from this conversation? It's being recorded, great. But I think, yeah, that's people, staff, we talked about that with Jennifer, that makes the most sense, right? It's right there. You could probably pick up a couple on street, but, yeah, makes sense. And we even talked about, could you do some combined, what did you call it?
tuck under?
Tuck under, using, if we can have a conversation, like a cross-access easement, maybe there's some other benefits we can work out with the 8-unit. Maybe there's a way to, you know, marry them together in some interesting way. Not sure. But that could be beneficial because there is a bigger parking field behind their building that's not the most efficient layout.
What are next steps?
Go to
For
that
tonight.
slide.
Oh, yeah, so the next steps for us are to take this feedback, incorporate that in that dialogue in the report so that you have sort of this conversation. I think there's some changes to be made in the report itself of how we frame this conversation and the next steps. But the next steps for us and for y'all are sort of having that community conversation as part of this comp plan effort. Continuing the conversation with developers and getting that feedback, and deciding what recommendations in the comp plan in terms of housing to move forward with. And then it's sort of, I think once that comprehensive plan process is decided, once the report is out, it's okay, how do we actually implement this? Is it zoning changes? Is it just conversations with the developer? Is it both? So the next steps for us are to wrap up that report, and continue the conversation with developers.
I guess we have one more question via the internet.
Yeah, we have just a comment thanking you for the presentation, saying there's new and exciting ideas presented, and then another question saying there are wetlands in the area west of Sunset Terrace.
Yeah.
This I think has precluded developments in the past. How do you plan to get around this?
So we know that these, yes, we have sort of a protected area where we looked at the wetland map, but I do think these are all first pass visualizations, right? There would need to be a site, a civil engineer, stormwater.
Wetland delineations if necessary. all.
Yeah, you would need a survey, all of those things that we didn't, that would take an
Planning
more
concepts.
in-depth look. And we are not, that was not our intention with that project, so there definitely needs to be, there would need to be many more steps for this to become a viable site plan that you would put to permit. That's not the intention with these. But it hopefully will stir conversations with developers to say what's possible on these sites and what does the community actually want to see.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. And I guess if we have something that's posted that maybe was posted too proactively, might be best not to have it posted any longer.
That's up to you guys, and we'll,
mean,
we're
I'm not
making,
sure
we
what-
got some feedback, I think there's, by and large, I hope that the report itself is helpful. I think it's more of small tweaks to the changing, the framing, what the information in there is actually intended for. And it's not stating you're putting your rubber stamp on any one of these recommendations. These are recommendations we would make if you want to deliver missing middle housing. These are the steps we do. So I think there's edits we'll make to frame that better, and based on feedback we've gotten from staff and this conversation. And then that is up to y'all of how public, whether you use it as more of an internal documentation. I mean, I think in many instances, the opportunity sites chapter and the missing middle chapter may be the starting point with the community to better understand what types do you want to see. And then the zoning is sort of a different chapter for more internal facing for staff to understand if you want, if the community says we want this type of housing, how do we get there? And that's the sort of, it's sort of both. But that, most of the in the weed stuff is sort of next step for staff to actually implement.
No, appreciate that, and I know Drew and Claire and the team will be working their way through that, certainly. But no, thank you very much, Jennifer, very, very enlightening.
Thanks for having me.
Creates a lot of discussion points, and that's very nice.
Thank you so much. Appreciate all your comments.
Thank you. Agenda item number 4, staff report.
The only item that I have is that we will still have our regular meeting that's scheduled later this month. We have a few different public hearing items scheduled for that.
All right, agenda item number 5, commissioners report. Agenda item number 6, adjournment, motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second,
Second?
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. No, thank you very much.